So this is just going to be a short presentation as an introduction to principles in debating. We're first going to talk about how you should run a principle and when you should run a principled argument in a debate. The first question you might want to ask yourself is, why would you want to run a principle? While the distinction is often not super clear-cut, when you run a principle, this is often in contrast to pragmatic or utilitarian arguments, which tend to focus purely on how much good or bad happens to a maximum number of people. When you are running a principled argument, therefore, in general, you are arguing for an alternative way of assessing a policy rather than just purely what the consequences are that emerge from it. So for instance, you might be arguing that an action is morally wrong or is morally required for reasons that are independent of the other consequences that other teams have talked about or will talk about in the future if there are speakers speaking after you. What does this therefore mean when you run one? Whether fair or not, when you are running a principled argument, when all other teams have focused on consequences only, judges will often think that you have a higher burden of justifying why they ought care about your principles. And this is usually applicable when you're running a principle in most cases, unless you're in specific debates where the nature of the motion being specifically philosophy-based or for some other reason means that many other teams are also running principles alongside you. Therefore, given this almost usually implicit higher burden that judges place on you, you have to be very careful about how and when you run a principled argument in a debate. I think, firstly, what this means for when you outrun a principled argument is it's important to understand that a principled argument is just another way of winning a debate. In many instances, you can simply win on the pragmatic outcomes itself. So this is just one strategy you might employ if you think that a motion, based on your own judgment, is just screaming that there's a principle to be run. You think that there's just some very strong normative or moral claim that you can make. And then in those instances, you can make these arguments. But just keep in mind that many judges will place a higher burden on you, so you have to be very careful about how you run one. I think the other thing I would point out is I would try not to run only a principle. While you can and may very well win by just running a principle, it is often much safer to run a principled argument alongside other arguments, given these are both just multiple ways of winning a debate and the higher burden placed on you for doing so. And I think that is a very brief, but I think important understanding of when to run a principle and the kind of constraints you might face or the constraints that other teams impose upon you when running a principle in terms of responding to all their pragmatic material or explaining why your principle ought beat it. With that in mind, I think we can go to a very, and I stress very, basic structure of running a principled argument, because a principled argument is much like a pragmatic argument, doesn't have a very simple structure that you can always use. Principled arguments can vary in structure, but I think this might be a useful way of conceptualizing principled arguments if you are new to them or have not run them before. I think the first thing is about accurately labeling the argument. And this might sound like trivial and generic debate advice, but I think it is especially important when talking about principles rather than anything else. While you should always be specific about what argument you are making, at least when making consequentialist arguments, the judge is usually aware that you are gesturing towards some harm or benefit. Principles are not usually about physical harm or benefit in the same way that consequentialist arguments are, so you want to very clearly tell the judge what you are about to argue so that they can track your analysis and understand why you are explaining what you are explaining when you make the argument. Realize that no judge is the same, and many have very specific note-taking styles, many may only write down things when they think it's relevant to the argument you're making, and sometimes judges just fail to track things properly. So very accurately labeling your argument forces the judge to fairly track the relevant claims they are making, or at least allows judges who would have done that anyway to track in a very efficient way, since they know exactly what the argument you're making is, and therefore can use whatever note-taking style they're using to accurately write down what you are saying. So, for example, when you say that our first claim will be that this is morally abhorrent because it unfairly uses and harms people who have done nothing to deserve it, that tells the judge exactly what argument you're making and where the principled argument is going to be coming from, and therefore the judge will be looking out for that type of analysis and is much more likely to write it down and understand the chain of logic that you are then making. The second part is actually making the argument, and I think a surprisingly common mistake that people make when arguing principles is that they don't actually make the argument and just try to leap onto common societal narratives or intuitions that they possess and believe other people might possess. So for instance, you will see many people say, obviously freedom matters, or that since we all agree self-defense is valid, we should be okay with this, and that might be in reference to a motion about some action that they're saying is equal to self-defense. I think at times like this, it is important to remember that principled arguments are just like any other arguments. They are not something that is taken as given, and you should be coming up with reasons for the claim you are making, even if it might seem intuitive to you, or to a family member, or to a friend who shares your views. I think a good example is this House prefers a weak democracy to a benevolent autocracy, which is a motion you might face. In this motion, if you are arguing in favor of the democracy, you can't simply say that democracy is an intrinsic right because you believe it is and many people might believe it is, but you might argue that democracy is an intrinsic right because of XYZ reasons that you will come up with during prep time. We'll go into a bit more detail on how to make some of these common principled arguments in the next section, but I think the core takeaway is that principled arguments are still arguments, and they require just as much reasoning and justification as other consequentialist claims, and it is not sufficient to just play on people's intuitions alone, and you should be providing the reasoning that you would any other argument. The third part I'm going to talk about is illustration, and this might seem immediately contradictory to the last part. Don't just rely on illustrations and intuitions, but illustrations and intuitions are actually a critical part of a principled argument as well, once you have given the justification or are about to give the justification. It's important to remember that your judge is human too, and almost every human has intuitions about the world that are not utilitarian or not consequentialists. You want to make sure you frame your principled argument around those intuitions to combat people's general intuition for caring about consequences more. As we said before, whether fair or not, judges often implicitly or explicitly place a higher burden on principled arguments because they're just so used to pragmatic debating or so tuned into the idea of listening to consequences. Therefore, to try and counteract this effect and try to make your principle more plausible, you want to frame your argument around one of these central intuitions that almost everyone has. I think to use a classic argument, I think most people would say that murdering a patient as a doctor so that you could use their organs to save 5 others is morally wrong, and we shouldn't do it even though it saves lives. This is a very classic instance in which the utilitarian and consequentialist would say we should kill the person because we have greater consequences because we save 5 people. But I think you would find very few people in the world that are willing to accept this scenario because we all have intuitions that this is probably an extremely morally wrong thing to do. Something like this makes it much more plausible for the judge to believe what you are saying because what you are saying is grounded in their already pre-existing beliefs, in the same way that consequences are ingrained in their pre-existing beliefs to matter a lot. Therefore, when arguing a principle, you'll want to use a thought experiment like the one above to make sure you appeal to that intuition in people and make sure you don't get discredited for not running something that is based on consequences. And this is almost perhaps the most important part of any principle, because at the end of the day, it's important to realize that every argument is always reliant on one premise that can never be proven. In fact, it's often impossible to prove a premise. You can always keep asking why to a premise and never reach a final answer. In fact, you can throw that question towards someone who says principles don't matter. You can say, well, why do consequences matter? And if you keep asking that why, and you eventually reach that question, why do consequences matter, you don't really have an answer. They just do. We as humans, and therefore debaters and judges, at some point just accept a premise to be true, because otherwise there is no way to engage in a debate, since at some point there's no more chain of reasoning. You just have to accept a premise or not. The illustration is really important for you to appeal to a judge's intuitions for building that primary premise that starts the rest of your argument, or is the kind of central part of the argument that you are making. For the purpose of this lecture and this general structure, I've put this illustration as happening once you've already made the argument, since most people's struggles is not with the illustration or intuition, but with the creation of the argument, but you can also make it go before. The reason I personally recommend doing it this way is so that you force yourself to actually make the argument rather than relying on these examples. However, of course, if you have a particularly complex or unintuitive principle, it might be worth doing this beforehand. Often you can do it before, after, or both. First, you might want to illustrate, so you can start with an operating premise. Then, when the argument is complete, you might want to illustrate again how the whole principle plays out. This all comes down to the type of debate you're doing, but it's just very important to remember that this is a critical part of making a principled argument. Cool. Now we're just going to move into a few examples of common principled contentions, and by no means is this going to be an exhaustive list of all the principled issues you might face in a debate, but I just want to apply what we just talked about in terms of the structure to a few situations, and maybe talk about a few arguments just to give you a picture of what they might look like. And for the rest, you may go explore them on your own, come up with ideas yourself, or maybe just leave it to prep time if you have an idea that you want to explore. So the first idea is democracy, and you might see a lot of debates about either directly about democracy or relating to democracy in some manifestation. I think example motions that are very specifically about democracy where principles might play a part are this house prefers a weak democracy to a benevolent dictatorship, as we saw above, or this house prefers a technocracy to a representative democracy. So in terms of approaching this motion, I think when you're making principled arguments about any motion, you want to break down what the motion is fundamentally getting at. So in this instance, you want to break down what a democracy fundamentally at its heart is. It is people having the right to vote in order to express their preference over what the state should do. That is fundamentally what a democracy is. Obviously, this is a very simple definition, but I think this comes to the core of the principled contention about democracy. And therefore, your principle might focus on this premise. A basic conceptualization of a principle defending democracy might look like this. Your label, and therefore what the judge is looking for, might be, given states exert enormous influence over citizens, we require consent from the citizens for the state to be legitimate. The first premise, I think, is something that is very obvious and most people would accept, that the state is coercive and restricts people's freedoms. It implements laws, it says what you can and cannot do. The second premise is probably the fundamental premise of the argument, that it is wrong to restrict people's freedom, and this can be for XYZ reason. I'm not going to go into the specific reasons here, but there's a number that you can name about why freedom matters. Maybe it's we care about freedom because every individual knows what's best for themselves. We care about freedom for a variety of other reasons. This is something for everyone to come up with themselves, depending on the specific nature of the debate. And you might want to pause to illustrate an example here. What is an intuition that we shouldn't restrict people's freedom? I think it's a very common intuition that slavery, for example, is wrong, and I think that is a very clear demonstration of it being wrong to restrict a person's freedom. I think the third premise here is that given that you restrict freedom, people should be entitled to a vote to account for this restriction. This is so they can have some say in the way they are governed, so you're not overwhelmingly restricting them and they still have some say over what's happening to them. Now, this is just a very, very basic example of a principled argument in favor of democracy to kind of illustrate how you would go about discussing it. You can go in plenty of further directions with this, especially in debates regarding how much the state should intervene in people's lives, whether democracies should restrict who can run for office or who can vote. For example, you might have debates about letting immigrant workers vote, or you might have debates about lowering the voting age. These are all kind of debates where principles about democracy might come in. I haven't prepared a formal conceptualization of a principle opposing democracy, but an example might be attacking that very argument about freedom. You might say, well, why do we care about freedom? We care about freedom because we think people are best placed to make their own choices because they know the best about themselves. So fundamentally, the reason we care about freedom is because we care about the outcomes that happen. And as a result, we might prefer a benevolent dictatorship for XYZ reason because they lead to outcomes. And you can get a lot more sophisticated with these types of principles, but I think this kind of gives you a grounding of how to look at these types of debates by pinning down what the fundamental underpinning of this contention is. And if you look at the real world, this is kind of the argument that is made. People are free, you can't coerce individuals, people have a right to representation. And you'll often find that even though you can't rely on common societal narratives, because you actually have to make the argument, the common societal narrative, or the way people think about these things in the real world, gives you a good starting base about where you can start formulating the actual argument around the motion. The other instance, and this is not really specific, is debates where you defend a numerically small group of people. Maybe the individuals being harmed by this motion and you're opposing it are smaller. Maybe the people that are being benefited are smaller. I don't really have a specific example motion here, but I'm sure many of you will encounter situations where the group that is being harmed by the other side is smaller than the one being benefited. I just want to say before I go into some arguments here that obviously you have standard weighing mechanisms here of things like the intensity of harm and the probability of harm. So you might say, well, we don't care if our group is smaller because they're being harmed a lot more, or we don't care if our group is smaller because the likelihood of harm is a lot greater than the likelihood of benefit. These are obviously ways you can try and deal with these cases, but I'm just going to point out two kind of principled ideas you might want to draw on. The first is claims about the illegitimacy of instrumentalization. And the essential thesis here is that it's not fair to use someone else to benefit a completely separate individual. And I think a common thought experiment here is the same one we talked about before, with respect to the doctor who shouldn't kill a person to use their organs for 5 others. I think the actual systematic reasoning here is a bit too dense to talk about and could probably fill an entire lecture itself, but this is often grounded in ideas about how people are separate entities that can't be traded off in ways that make sense. A fundamental separateness of persons claim. What makes you special is very different from what makes me special, and to say that some benefit to you is equivalent to this harm to me is a bit of a weird way to think about things when people experience the world in different ways, when people have different utilities, when people experience harms in different ways. And then this is just one way to kind of talk about why it's illegitimate to instrumentalize people. There are other ways, but I think this is one that is to highlight, and I think it is worth kind of exploring yourself or researching or thinking about ways in which you might prove that, individuals deserve to be treated as separate from other individuals in so a way that you can't just trade someone off for someone else. I think intuitively we all believe this to some extent with the doctor's analysis, with the doctor's example I gave above, but it's worthwhile to try and ground it in actual argumentation. And I think this, is something people should explore if they find it interesting, / just think about if they ever want to use it in a debate. The other type of way you can draw on principles here is special obligations claims. And this is essentially arguments about how we owe special obligations to one specific group over another because of some characteristic. Maybe they have been oppressed by another group, have some rights claims over something, or just generally a class we wish to protect. I think, for instance, racial groups are often something we might talk about here in terms of being oppressed by another group, and therefore we owe special obligations to them over one other group. I think another good example is in debates about parents versus children. There are often instances in which when you might be debating a specific regulation with respect to taking care of children. And, maybe these are regulations where a small section of children are protected, but there are harms for many, many parents for listening to this regulation. Maybe it restricts the way they can, talk to their child. Maybe it restricts the things they can do with them. Maybe it restricts the kind of activities they can take part of. It'll cause some inconvenience to many parents, but it protects a small group of children from a lot of harms. You can argue that we care much, much more about any harm to children than inconveniences to parents because of some special property we believe children have, that they are, they are someone we ought care about because we brought them into this world, or they're particularly vulnerable. Here I think is actually a good example of how pragmatics and principles often bleed into each other, because you might be combining a principle about special obligations with a pragmatic claim about how small an inconvenience might be. So for instance, you might say, because of XYZ reason that you have come up with, we should give special privilege to children when evaluating these trade-offs. And given that we give special privilege to children, and this is a very small inconvenience for parents, we therefore ought to prioritize the children in this debate. And I think it is often useful in debates like this to kind of conceptualize how the principal argument you are making might combine with other small pragmatic claims to kind of blend together to create one cohesive big case. So those are just two very common examples, one specifically about democracy and second about just a generic instance that you might face in a debate. But I think this hopefully paints a picture of how you might go about employing a basic structure, or how you might go about thinking about instances where you might want to use a principle and creating that argument.
All right. Hi, everyone. So I'll be taking the second bit of this lecture. And so this isn't going to be a long bit. It's just to quickly illustrate many ways in which principal arguments can be responded to and engaged to in a debate. Because whilst it's true, principal arguments kind of exist in an absolute sense. And obviously, I think once a principal argument is established, it does require a little bit of work in engaging with it, more so than consequentialist arguments or disagreements on how like reactions exist in society. I think thinking about how to respond to principal arguments requires you to consider the many ways in which this is possible. I don't think that's just one way. So I'll kind of go through the four most basic ones. So the first one I think is basically where there is a disagreement of what is the principal consideration or what we ought to act as a maxim of what is just or fair or like ensures equality, etc. The things we hold to be morally correct in society. Now, when you are so when an argument is made, so for example, an argument is made for why people are allowed to be violent in self-defense. Okay, so like women, for example, social movements, they're a pretty common argument that is run. So if you present a differing moral calculus, you would suggest possibly that if there is greater amounts of violence being done in that society, then it is most likely to harm the most vulnerable members of that minority group who are more likely to incur things like backlash or hatred or hate crimes, etc. So, I mean, that is pretty consequentialist of me, but I think the point here is that you got to present a different calculus for which we ought to view what is the most just and equal way of interacting with a particular consideration or presenting a reason or a moral justification for why something can exist. So that I think is the first bit of response that you can have, which is present a principle for another consideration. If you are able to prove that that principle is more important to the actors in the debate or more important as a matter of what we ought to follow as human beings, then you are able to kind of beat the other principle in terms of just analysis for why we ought to care about it. Look, I'm not saying that it's easy to compare these two principal arguments, but I do think thinking about a different moral calculus is a good starting point in establishing to the judge that there is not just one way to view the correct like moral position on this particular issue. So I do think that's a pretty good strategy when it's done. Now, so that's broadly the first one. The second one I think you can employ is a disagreement on the way to best reflect a principle that is agreed upon. What do I mean by this? So for example, if someone makes an argument, principal argument for why self-defense ought to be okay, for example, you can agree with the person that self-defense is a principle that we ought to care about. And you're not disagreeing on the fact that that's a moral principle or a consideration that we should care, but you are disagreeing about whether or not the position or the policy or whatever action that the other team is doing in their case best reflects this principle. So for example, if the Gov team says that we ought to support violence by minority movements that are like revolutionary violence because it is self-defense, because there's no other way in which they're able to protect themselves. So on the opposition, you would query whether or not enacting violence against broader society, whether or not it is analogous to self-defense and therefore the principle extends. So obviously you would consider whether or not, because self-defense is the last line of defense, the alternative to self-defense is always dying. You want to query whether or not engaging in violence increases the propensity for like death and violence, or whether or not it decreases it, because if it increases it, then it can't be self-defense. I mean, this is one example that I think is very commonly done, and that's why I'm using it. So I do think you can agree on the principle, disagree on whether or not that principle applies in this situation, or disagree on whether or not the analogy can be made between two situations that are purportedly about the same principle. So that's, I think, the second way in which you can respond to a principal argument. Now, the third and fourth way are a little bit interlinked, and I'm going to just explain this together. The first one is obviously, I think there are very good reasons to have a utilitarian calculus, and that's tied very much to the consideration that the world that maximizes the most amount of happiness for the most amount of people, or the flip of that, which is minimizes the harms for the most amount of people, or the most quantity of that thing in reality, is the way that we should operate society. And I think the point in a utilitarian calculus or any consequentialist arguments about why we ought to care about the eventual outcome that is disjunct from the principle that another team has made in the debate, you really want to explain why what is just and fair is probably the one that minimizes this. And I think the analysis goes along the lines of, obviously there are many ways to carve up human resources and carve up the way we react to certain things, right? You can approximate and like decide certain groups should be privileged over other groups, etc., etc. But given that there is no meaningful way to differentiate human life in that all lives are equal and equally random and equally deserving of protection to minimize harm. So one person's pain is not worth more protection than another. The utilitarian calculus kind of assumes that therefore, as much as we can maximize happiness for the most amount of people, that's the way we ought to be moving forward in society, which I think is a pretty solid logical reason for why we ought not to care about those principles. And I think the second, so that comes layered in with the next thing I'm going to talk about, which is the minimization of harm. Now, obviously it's, I think, like part and parcel of the utilitarian calculus, which I've established earlier, but I wanted to talk about how do you frame consequentialist arguments against principal arguments. And I think, like I said, I don't think principal arguments can be beaten by consequentialist arguments the same way a consequentialist argument can be defeated by explaining harms or benefits. But I do think you can set up what the judge ought to prioritize in the debate. And I think the most obvious way that I think a lot of people do, but they don't consciously think about what you have to do to prove it. And I think the position is just that, look, insofar as we care about what is moral and just, there's a hierarchy of what we ought to care about as human beings. And notions of fairness and equality in the process, if it doesn't eventually lead to a conclusion that is on net more beneficial, then that's probably not the principle, that's not the reflection of that principle in reality. So we must work with reality in a way that objectively and realistically minimizes harms. Okay, so I think obviously the best example here is like the debate about violence by minority groups versus appeasement. So obviously there are good reasons for why violence ought to be allowed or at least permissible, for the reasons that these people are obviously victims of a system that doesn't protect them, and all the reasons for why there's very little redress. You would spend time explaining why this is a just and permissible action for this community, therefore you support it. The other team, obviously, doing nothing or being more appeasement oriented, which is just working within the system, is obviously, I think, a bit hard to prove is principally just, for the reasons that unless you prove the system or on balance ought to be preserved over destroyed, or at least or that system is worth defending. It's very hard to defend people existing in that system, but you could. But I think the other strategy that people employ on the opposition is to just say, look, I think what is in an essence a process, which is violence, eventually leads to a situation where we are worse than we currently are, which obviously then makes it a lot harder for us to protect these people within the system. If the goal of the teams in the debate is to ensure these people are protected within the system because we failed them in the past, surely failing them in the future is just as bad, if not worse, because we are actively and consciously doing it. So I think that's the way you can frame arguments about consequences, even if the principle backing for it isn't so obvious or doesn't seem as important, and juxtapose that against material from the other team about their principal argument. So yeah, I mean, there are other ways to do this, but I think at this point, these four things are a pretty good starting point. And I hope that that completes our thoughts on principal argumentations.